number of people here. Um, and this is obviously extremely important bill, but it's also, I must say that we are going to try to be as inclusive as possible and hear from all sides and everyone, but we're under a deadline. And yesterday I had a meeting, and people were saying, how can you possibly wait till next Friday to vote the bill out? That means the House won't have much time to work on it. And I said, well, but you're saying be inclusive and try to hear from as many people as possible. But then you're saying, vote it out so the House gets it by the end of next week. So I don't know what'll happen there. I'm going to wait to hear from Senator Ash and Speaker Johnson. I did have a conversation with Maxine Grad about it. It may be that we will have a combination meeting, even Monday afternoon, with both committees. And I don't know what they want to do, but I don't know how you can hear from people and then not hear from people and vote it out quickly. So anyway, that's the constraint. Matt Valerio is the Defender General. And Matt, thank you for being here. You're our first witness.
Yes, thank you. I am, first of all, I'm mindful that there are other individuals who are scheduled to testify who are not regularly in this committee. In the event that those folks would prefer to go before me, I'm happy to do that, although I am prepared to go forward if you want to.
Well, I'm going to offer to Curtis Reed or Bor Yang an opportunity. Thank you very much, Matt, if they'd like to go first.
No problem.
Either one of you who, I don't know your schedules, and if you.
I am scheduled to be here all morning. So Curtis, I defer to you.
All right, thank you. I also scheduled my time, blocked out 3 hours to be with you as well.
Okay, maybe you want to hear a little of the testimony and then comment, Curtis. That would be extremely helpful. And I really appreciate both of you taking and blocking off 3 hours for this committee.
Well, as you know, this isn't my first rodeo.
I know that. By the way, I read the Bennington Banner and your name appears so frequently that Senator Campion is getting jealous.
Oh.
That's kind of an inside joke. We kid about Senator Campion trying to get publicity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Anyhow.
So would you like me to go, Senator Sears?
Would you prefer to kick it off? I think it would be actually very appropriate for the chair that for the executive director of the Human Rights Commission.
I am happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
For the record, my name is Bor Yang, and I am the executive director and legal counsel for the Vermont Human Rights Commission. First, I would like to thank Senator Baruth for sponsoring this bill and Senator Sears for taking it up. And I know that a lot of hard work and meaningful discussions went into amending this bill to the draft that we have now. So you have taken up these issues with the same urgency as the issues surrounding this pandemic. And for that, I thank all of you. There is no denying that the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis jolted many Americans awake to the disparate treatment that African Americans have experienced at the hands of law enforcement. What is particularly compelling about this case was that he was being arrested for supposedly using a $20 counterfeit bill, that he didn't resist, that he didn't have any firearms on him, and that many, including Mr. Floyd himself, asked for his life to be spared, and that these officers ignored those pleas. Even more, everything was caught on video. But I ask all of us today to consider for a second what would have happened if Mr. Floyd had resisted, if his hands had been in his pocket, or if he had been accused of robbing a grocery store. Would we still feel equally appalled by how these officers acted and failed to act in this instance? And would putting a knee on Mr. Floyd's neck while he cried, "I can't breathe," been justified then? For years, African Americans have been killed, and we as non-Black people have justified those killings in one way or another without question. We have failed to honor the dignity and humanity of the victim. We have criminalized those victims before they were ever charged or convicted. We often argue that they deserved what they received because they resisted. We never truly examined whether use of force in each of these instances was necessary or excessive, and if the officers were motivated by hate or bias against the victims until now. This is why this is a momentous occasion. Through this bill, this committee and this legislature acknowledges that our criminal justice system is flawed and that our standards for use of force has perpetuated violence against African Americans, as well as other people of color, as well as people with psychiatric disabilities, as well as people in poverty. Today, we don't just honor the life of George Floyd, but we also honor the thousands of others who were murdered, but whose deaths were not recorded. We honor the voices of Black and Brown people in Vermont and across the country who have been telling us for years what has been happening. And before I turn to the bill itself, it is my obligation to share that this bill, while very good, does fall significantly short of the systemic changes that we need to see. All across the country and right here in Vermont, people are calling for the police to be defunded. We have long over-relied on the police to respond to community issues that are beyond their capacity, such as mental health issues, homelessness, substance use abuse, and poverty. We need to invest resources to address these issues directly and to stop criminalizing our citizens. Additionally, we need a civilian oversight board and or independent entity outside the Attorney General's office and the state's attorney's office to review police use of force. The State Police Advisory Commission is not sufficient. They serve in an advisory capacity and they are all appointed by the governor. They do not represent the people of Vermont. A civilian oversight board should be selected for community members, ideally people of color, disability advocates, immigrants, etc. We owe a duty to investigate previous cases of police use of force because there are families in this state still waiting for justice. We cannot move forward without correcting our past wrongs. And I want to be clear that my comments here have nothing to do with how I feel about the Attorney General's office or the Attorney General himself. I have a lot of respect for them, and I know that they work tirelessly in that office to ensure justice. But this is about removing discretion around police shootings from one individual to a body of people. Even at the Human Rights Commission, where I serve as the executive director, where we rarely see cases involving any deaths, and they are just civil in nature, I don't make unilateral decisions. These are decisions that are made by an entire commission. I would like to also add that this bill is missing an important cross-cultural component around use of force. Cultural competency is key to all forms of de-escalation. There are specific critical thinking skills that can give police officers tools to interact and communicate with people with psychiatric disabilities and non-white communities. And I want to share a quick example with you, another disturbing incident from Minnesota. One morning in early February, I think this was just last year, the year before that, an 81-year-old Asian American grandmother was in her shed in her backyard. The police get a report from a neighbor about a possible burglary suspect. They show up, they shouted warnings in English, and when they received no response, they sent in their dog. That dog viciously bit her. Only when they took her into custody did they realize that she was a senior citizen, she was in her own shed, which was in her own yard, and that she didn't speak English and could not have understood her. She had no reason to believe that they were even speaking to her. Cultural competency means that officers recognize that we have community members whose primary language is not English. It means that they think of alternatives other than sending in their dog or use of force. It may have required that they knock on the door in this case, making louder noises, walking closer, throwing something to draw this person's attention, maybe using an interpreter in that city or town. You will hear from law enforcement today, and they do absolutely deserve our respect for the hard work that they do. But I urge you not to be swayed by arguments that they are already doing implicit bias work, that they have mechanisms in place for de-escalating, or they have an oversight system, or that this bill might be unnecessary or confusing. It is not. And what they have been doing is not enough. And the onus is on all of us to ensure that every single person in Vermont is treated equally and fairly by law enforcement, and that they receive the same protection and services, regardless of their race, color, national origin, disability, gender identity, or socioeconomic status. The other day, Representative Colson asked me a theoretical question. He said, how do we engage racism through our heart and not through our head? And I don't really have a great answer to that. I know what I try to do in all my trainings, and that is I tell stories. And the story of how George Floyd was murdered is today, and the opportunity to engage with our hearts is really upon us now. I would now like to turn to S219. The Human Rights Commission supports the requirement that all state grants be conditioned on compliance with race data reporting. We'd like to see a requirement that grants are conditioned on the entity's overall compliance with the fair and impartial policing policy statute. We also recommend that data collected should also be reported to the Executive Director of Racial Equity, not just in the event the chosen vendor is unable to receive data. We support the language that use of deadly force should only be employed when necessary. But we also ask that you consider making all use of force fall under the same necessary standard. One, having two standards can be confusing to officers. And two, reasonable use of force may in fact lead to substantial harm and even death when the victim is particularly vulnerable. I remind you of the story of that 81-year-old grandmother who was bitten by the dog. If the standard in that case had been necessary, the police officers may not have sent in their dog and she would not have been harmed. Under the definition for totality of the circumstances, I would also suggest that we include both the words and the conduct of the subject. That means that officers should consider when a subject is crying for help, stating he can't breathe or is having a panic attack. On page 6 of 13, and I'm happy to provide these to you in writing later as well, or to Bryn. On page 6 of 13, line
I'm sorry, I was muted myself. It would be really helpful to have your comments in writing.
Absolutely.
At any point, and
I will
know
submit
Bryn's
that.
taking copious notes, but
Yeah.
As
So
we go
lines
back
8 to
over the bill.
13, we would recommend deleting everything starting on line 11 that says rather than with the benefit of hindsight, and that let me read the whole paragraph so that I'm clear about that. So page 6, lines 8 says, the decision by law enforcement officer to use force shall be evaluated from the perspective of a reasonable officer in the same situation based on the totality of the circumstances known to or perceived by the officer at the time. I would suggest that we add a period there and delete the remaining parts of that paragraph, which states, rather than with the benefit of hindsight, and that the totality of the circumstances shall account for occasions when officers may be forced to make quick judgments about using of force. And the reason why I suggest that is because I think that language is unnecessary, it's redundant, and it's already accounted for in the language above. Also, we have to be thinking about how judges and a civilian oversight board or the attorney general would be reviewing this after the fact. And I think this language provides too much deference to law enforcement. I don't think that the legislature is really seeking to create deference to law enforcement. I think they are seeking a truly fair and impartial review of an incident without deference to anyone. We absolutely support the inclusion of improper.
Yep, I believe all of the use of force language came from a bill in California as introduced, and I don't know how it's working in practice, obviously. So, and it's very new. So.
You are correct about that. That is fairly new, and it does come from California. I think that we have an opportunity here in Vermont to do more and to do better. The Human Rights Commission also supports the inclusion of improper restraints by police officers as a category B conduct that is punishable under a criminal statute. And we also support equipping all of our officers with video recording devices. However, we know that sometimes officers do not turn these on or fully utilize them during an incident. And we recommend that the Fair and Impartial Policing Policy statute be amended to ensure that failure to use video recording devices violates the statute and policies. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have for me.
No, thank you very much, Board. That was succinct and very helpful. Are there questions from the committee of Boryang? Senator Baruth, you're muted.
Thanks very much, Bor. Just, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. On that last point, I'm glad you brought that up. That was a point of concern yesterday. I went back and looked through the body cam model policy, and it does make it clear there's a shall, that they shall activate body cameras and report if they're not working, but nowhere in that policy does it mention a consequence if you don't do it.
Correct.
And so I agree. I think there should be a statutory mention of the penalty, and that the penalty should be for breaking the statute rather than the policy. That's my personal view.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions, comments on that? Can we go to the necessaries in the use of force? I did get an email, and many of you may have gotten the email yesterday regarding the term necessary to better define, and you mentioned necessary more. Yeah. Can you expand on the necessary? How that would help?
I think it is a stronger standard, and it is harder for and different from reasonable. The term reasonable is not even well defined too, and that's the term we're using now. That's a very terrible standard because one, it's not clearly defined, and it always depends on the circumstance. And I think the term necessary is really here an effort in California, but also now here, to ensure that when we are reviewing police use of force, that it requires something more than what you believed in at the time, but that we're taking into consideration everything that is happening and whether that was required, whether use of force was required in order to effectuate an arrest, right? And so I just take us back to that story of the 81-year-old grandmother who was in her own shed in her own backyard. Reviewing that, someone might say that meets a reasonable standard because they yelled to her a couple of times, she didn't pay attention, there was a call about a potential burglary suspect, maybe she had dark clothes on, and someone might say it was reasonable then to send in a dog. But if we had used the standard necessary, the onus then is on the police to think about alternatives before engaging in that type of force.
So,
Senator,
yeah, Senator White, go ahead. I have a thought, but I'll wait to hear from you.
So we're in as you know, in GovOps, we're looking at a lot, and I would we're looking at what the discipline already is and adding to that discipline for breaches of code of conduct. And so I just want to make sure that we're doing the same thing here, because so that we're not working at odds. But I will read something that we got yesterday that, and I think we need to pay attention to this. A few things about the use of force discussion around what type of force tactics. Our training teaches that mere presence of a police officer is a use of force by law enforcement, as are verbal commands, physical constraints, compliant handcuffing, pain compliance techniques, assaultive techniques, and lethal force. I would suggest being explicit on the type of force we're looking to report. All law enforcement officers are trained on a force continuum, which includes escalation and de-escalation from the Academy's initial training. It explicitly defines these things, so it shouldn't be hard to specify. Because if in training, use of force begins at the mere presence, we really need to be very specific here, because the mere presence of a police officer is considered a use of force, as is a verbal instruction. So I think we need to be really careful here that we're not pulling in everything.
I think this bill, thank you, Senator White, for that. I think this bill actually uses the term physical force. And so it wouldn't just be mere presence. And so I think that that covers it. And I don't think that there is confusion in the community about what use of force is, because I think it's anytime you're using physical force. But I hear you in that the training might be different and teaching something different. But in terms of reporting, I think this bill covers that it's physical force.
I agree. And the question became, is the use of a dog, for example, a use of physical force?
Yes.
In the example you cited from Minneapolis, certainly was a use of physical force to use the dog.
That dog is trained to attack and to physically attack, and that's why they sent in the dog. So yes, absolutely.
Did that fully examine your question, Senator White? The difference between physical force, physical use of force?
Not completely, because if putting on handcuffs is considered physical force, then I mean, I think we really
that becomes a form of restraint, though, doesn't it? Once I've placed handcuffs, well, I have never placed handcuffs on anybody. Just to be clear, once an officer places handcuffs on a person, that is both a use of force, but it's also a restraint technique.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. I'm trying to read this again, and I don't know that. Does it really say physical force? Does it say physical force?
The bill says physical force, yes.
Where?
Yesterday we were having throughout the use of force, physical. Bryn can point to it, but yesterday we had the discussion about it was the dog.
Yeah.
Extension of the physical force. So the bill clearly defines it as physical force.
So is it okay if I jump in for a minute?
Yeah, please, Bryn.
So for the record, Bryn here from the Legislative Council. There are two places I think that we might be talking about two different sections of the bill. And Senator White, I wonder if the testimony that you're reading was referring to the requirement that data be collected about the use of force. And that's where we have some context put around the word force, but it doesn't actually specify that force needs to be physical. And this committee had a conversation yesterday about whether that should be physical force or if it should also be intimidation tactics. So that's where physical force is not used, but within the policy for use of deadly force, it does specify that the force is physical force.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Anything further for Bor Yang? And thank you, Bryn.
Thanks, Bor.
Thank you, Senator White. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
And if something
and I'll be
comes
here
up,
if you have any other questions.
since you're here virtually, yeah, I guess it's virtual. Feel free to jump in or to suggest something during committee discussion. I want everybody to feel free to speak if they hear something. Okay.
I will. Thank you very much.
I think Curtis, I think I'm going to jump to Matt Valerio, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm fine.
And Matt, are you still here? Yeah, okay.
I don't go very far. Gotta keep an eye on you guys.
Well, somebody has to. Feel free.
Let me just, as many of us have during the last period of weeks, and those of us who work in the criminal justice system regularly have recognized this. But in reviewing information around the country and then looking to our own state in Vermont, in 2020 alone, the Washington Post study found that 1,038 people have been shot and killed by law enforcement in the last year. Of those, Black and Hispanic people are more than 4 times as likely to be shot and killed by law enforcement than white people. In Vermont, while Blacks and Hispanics represent only 3% of the total state population, according to the last census, they represent more than 14% of the Vermont prison population. Clearly, there's an issue. This year, with the killing of George Floyd, the issue has come to the fore and has struck a chord with people who may not even think about these issues on a regular basis. We in the public defense system and in the criminal justice system as a whole, I think about these issues on a regular basis because we see what comes before us, particularly those who are public defenders and are routinely attempting to vindicate the rights of individuals who are in the justice system. The thing that is heartening about what is happening now is that it is not just the defenders who are taking a look at this. It's prosecutors, it is law enforcement, it is the governor, and it's this committee. Some of the suggestions, although in different form, that are in this bill have come up any number of times in the last decade or longer, but there always tends to be in history a time when the time is right to do something. And I think that while there is still a very short amount of time to deal with this, this is the right time. I wouldn't be worried about, I wouldn't be in a position, or I wouldn't suggest to you that nothing be done now for worrying about the details. I think that you can get a decent bill out and the details can be worked out next year or the like if things are not workable. But turning to the bill, I do have a few comments. And one of the most important things, but one of the most difficult things to come by in Vermont is good, consistent data. And Section 1 of the bill attempts to do that. There was a discussion yesterday with, I believe Senator White was talking about it for a period of time, about different platforms that law enforcement uses to collect data, and then the different organizations that are around that analyze the data. And there is, of course, the Valcor system and the I'm spacing it, the Stillman or system that are out there, and they're different platforms. They have different codings. They have different fields that are able to be filled out. They all look to some degree at the same data, but they are different and they don't necessarily talk to each other. One of the things that we've been trying to do for many years is to try to get everybody on a consistent platform for reporting so that the data is consistent. I do know that for whatever reason, and I've always been involved in these data things because it's one of, I think, the strong points that I bring to the table is this statistical data analysis part of what I do. But we routinely have portions of the state that are left out of the data, information that's reported to the FBI for crime rates and the like, and VCIC data is also incomplete. So when you have a VCIC or the crime research group, the folks that used to be with Norwich, I guess they're independent now, but they will routinely say that, look, we're only looking at a portion of this. And when you ask what is not there, sometimes it's Burlington. I mean, sometimes it's not necessarily Chittenden County, but the Burlington PD use a different system than others in the county, and then different than what the state police use. I think we have to get on a consistent platform. So when I'm looking, and I know I'm just on page 1 right now, but I think it's very important to be able to understand what's going on, that we have some level of consistent data. Unfortunately, as with everything, when you're trying to reconcile it, that's a funding issue. But if we're serious about it, we've got to get serious about the data issue to make sure that it can be analyzed and people can look at the same numbers and come up with the same or close to the same conclusions about what they mean. Excuse me. To me, it's a small paragraph or a couple paragraphs in the bill, but it might be one of the more important things that you have to deal with. I'm going to
Senator Sears?
Good.
Well, I was just thinking while Matt is looking for his next statement that yesterday in GovOps, we talked a lot about the data reporting and the 2 systems. And in here, what I learned in here, and Bryn tried to explain it to me yesterday, and I think I was so thick, is that this is what the vendor that they're talking about here, that's going to be chosen by the Training Council, is actually the vendor that puts together those 2 systems. So it's much like People's Bank has one system and the Brattleboro Savings Bank has a different system, but the vendor that operates the ATM machines puts it together, and that's what this vendor does. And they've been working really hard, and there are a couple people in law enforcement that are kind of data nerds and tech nerds, and have been working with smaller departments to get them up to speed. The other problem here is that in reporting, we can have the similar reporting here, but when it gets fed into the FBI system, some of our crimes are different than they list them there. For example, some of our sexual assault crimes are different than what they are in the overall reporting system. So it's hard. It's easier to compare within Vermont now that they're working on this, but harder to compare nationally.
But I think that's all well and good.
Yeah,
The problem is we have 14% of African Americans incarcerated in Vermont. They represent, I can't think of the percentage of the total population, but it's well overrepresented. And because of the lack of data, we can't explain it. When the Justice Center looked at it, when other data gathering groups have looked at it, they can't explain it. And the Center for Justice Research has a 2-year grant, and hopefully they'll be able to explain it. But that could be several years down the road before we even know what the explanation is. All that leads to speculation about what the reason is, and it leads to further problems within the various communities. So I think, I don't want to, I mean, the bill is already complicated enough. I don't want to further complicate it, but Matt brings up a good point. But when, one of my frustrations was that I'd hoped to be able to have something concrete come out of the Justice Reinvestment 2 on the on the overuse of incarceration of people of color. And unfortunately, they weren't able to get it. So go ahead, Matt. I interrupted you and interrupted Senator White, but
That's fine. It goes in a different, I want to tell you about,
I'm also mindful I need to have, I didn't realize Mike Sterling had to leave. Commissioner Sterling has to leave by 10:30. So
if, like I said, if anybody wants to go in front of me, they can feel free. I'm always around. So, and I actually thought that Mike might be the one who would jump forward, but nevertheless, I have one of my the investigators for the Prisoners' Rights Office is Reuben Jennings, and you may
yes,
know,
Madam.
some people may know Reuben. He's a retired New York City police officer, and he came to hired him 20 years ago when I was very first Defender General, and he's been a great asset to our office. But one of the things that he observed, and he came over to my house just a couple of days ago, and we were talking about this, is that in his experience, when he compares his law enforcement background in New York City to the law enforcement that he has observed, and the use of force, even in the Department of Corrections, he is of the opinion that Vermont law enforcement and in the Department of Corrections as well fail to begin the procedure of confronting a suspect with de-escalation techniques. And he said in his experience, his observations are, and he also, by the way, served as a serious felony unit investigator for our most serious crimes unit that we have in defense, that we have to put more emphasis on the use of de-escalation techniques as a precursor to everything else on the scale of enforcement. So when he looked at, we've had various incidents where tasers were used, or beanbag guns, or pepper spray, or mace, or the use of a billy club or the like, that are not considered deadly force. So you have in section 4, it talks about deadly force. But all of those things, particularly tasers, beanbag guns, rubber bullets, those kinds of things were designed to as an alternative to deadly force, but they have become being used as an alternative, in his opinion, to de-escalation. So rather than some level of force that is not deadly, instead that would be a drop back from the use of deadly force, it's become a step up from de-escalation techniques. And he made the point very strongly to me just the day before yesterday, that when I talked to you about this issue, the focus is clearly on deadly force because that's what's in the news, but the focus should be as much on the use of de-escalation techniques and the use of alternatives to deadly force, as opposed to the alternatives to de-escalation as you ramp up the chain. I wanted to make a comment about that, a comment that Senator Baruth made yesterday, just in going through the bill, and he may well know it at this point, or there's a portion on page 5 that talks about this is on line 18, and it's in B sub 1, where the line is that every person has a right to be free from excessive force by officers acting under color of law, and that the term seemed I don't know, off-putting or out of character here. And I just wanted to explain, and maybe somebody else already has, that use of the term color of law is a term of art that is used in civil rights lawsuits under the section 1983 in the federal law. So the standard is that if somebody violates somebody's civil rights under the color of state or federal law, it gives rise to a tort claim against the government. And I'm sure that the use of the term there is one that is meant intended to mirror the law under federal law, and it's supposed to be used, and it's used in a positive way to vindicate the rights of individuals, where the government uses kind of the cloak of federal law as immunity to violate people's civil rights. And I just wanted to make clear that that was what that was about. The important part, I think, of
Unmuted. Matt, Senator Bruce had a question or comment.
yes, sure.
Just to comment, I take Matt's point that terms of art, move through the decades and through the centuries, but I do think that phrase is out of place in today's language. And what Bryn had suggested was under authority of law. I don't think we would disadvantage someone, or that a tort claim would not be able to be brought under authority of law rather than color of law. It clearly means the same thing, but it's a more sensitive way of saying it. I don't see how anybody could read a statute these days, see officers acting under color of law, and not think that it was an ironic reference to the systemic racism that we're talking about. So I take the point about terms of art, but they are subject to evolution, as is everything else.
Yep. Just so that I was, I just wanted to, anybody who had a question about it, I want them to understand where it came from.
Thanks.
Lawyers are such that we rely on precedent on a regular basis, and there are some who would love to see all Latin out of law. For the few Latin phrases I know, even though I was one of the probably last humans alive ever to take Latin in public school, it somehow gives me comfort that I spent a lot of money for something. In any event, meaning law school.
Yes.
So one of the suggestions regarding I find it interesting, and I don't know exactly what to do with it, but in section 4, line 17, under definitions of deadly force, they include it's included in there, including the discharge of a firearm. Deadly force means the use of force that creates a substantial risk causing death or serious bodily injury, including the discharge of a firearm. To me, that's one of the more obvious ones. But one of the things that we've seen is that these use of allegedly non-lethal weapons oftentimes lead to the death of individuals who are compromised in some way, and law enforcement doesn't realize it. Again, it speaks to the issue of information and de-escalation before anything rises to the level of deadly force. I didn't know if it was better to take out including discharge of a firearm, or whether it was more important to list other things that would otherwise, under the circumstances, be lethal, like tasers or clubs or the like. I found it odd to list discharge of firearm alone in a definition when there's many other things that could be listed. I didn't understand either we should have a longer list or that should be out of there is my guess. The circumstances are going to determine what lethal force is. We've seen individual die of wounds in a Burlington situation that it was fists. It wasn't discharge or use of any weapon whatsoever. To me, one of the most important parts of this bill is at the very end, and it is what we've been asking for ever since I've been Defender General. It's probably before me, and clearly technology has evolved during that period of time. But the universal use of body cameras in this day and age is almost it's very I don't know the argument against it at this point. There have been various arguments about cost of storage of information and the like, and that's what I've heard for the last 10 years or so. But at this point, when you can buy a terabyte drive for $39.99 from Amazon, and I know it'll have to be a little bit more than doing that to preserve it, but the storage of information is not the same issue that it used to be, and even the technology to have it, as many people have dash cams on their own cars, and that's why we get to see some of the things that we see now. We've been long supporters of this. I think it should have been done sooner, but let's do it now if we can get it done. And again, it is going to be an expense, but it's well worth it, in my view. Seeing and hearing what's going on is there's no replacement for that. And as I said, we can go through and parse particular words and phrases in the bill, but I'm more concerned that a bill get out, and that you can deal with the details that need to be refined over time than to have nothing get out. So I'm happy to support the effort that the Senate Judiciary is putting forward with the bill.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is to have an effective date on the Section 4 of, say, October 1st, 2020, excuse me. That by giving time, if there are some changes needed in that Section 4, people to comment on it when we come back in August for the second, for the large budget. And that buys some time to correct anything. And to me, it's an in between the idea of, well, let's do a task force, which I don't know where we get with a task force. So
Well,
just a thought, Matt.
Depends on how many of what have on the task force, as we know. Right. To me, there's that, and there's also the issue of there needs to be some for law enforcement, there needs some level of time, I think, for retraining.
Yeah,
it's not just you pass the law and immediately.
Can you speak a little bit about, because of your experience in terms of restraint, to proper wording in the bill on the restraint section? I know I'm basing these comments based on the Woodside federal lawsuit.
Right.
So I don't believe, if I remember it, there were chokeholds used, but there were other forms of restraint that were improper and dangerous to the person being restrained besides chokeholds.
Right. And one of the things that we had, and there was the state lawsuit that was moot because the child at Woodside had been discharged, but the exact same facts came in the federal lawsuit. And really those findings were based upon the testimony of an expert on restraint techniques that we had come in and testify. And there are any number of, there were, I think, 3 or 4 different types of restraints that were considered illegal and improper by the federal judge. And one of the ones you brought up yesterday was the use of the knee to the back and the pulling the arms back. It wasn't what they call a full hog tie position, but it was one of the things that actually Ruben was talking to me about 2 days ago. Was this whole the use of the hog tie or semi hog tie type positions to restrain individuals. There are, and I'm not an expert on the techniques to do it the right way, but apparently there are techniques that can be used that the experts can come in and tell you about. We could definitely put you in touch with that expert to let you know about it. Another person, by the way, who knows a lot about the appropriate techniques is Marshall Paul, Deputy Defender General, because he's also the juvenile defender, but he used to work in a secure facility where restraint techniques would have to be used before he was a lawyer. And he could give you more information on that. There's probably a list of 5 or 6 that are commonly used improper restraints that may well be appropriate for listing in the bill together with others.
That was my point. I received training in restraint and proper restraint, but it was in about 2002 or 4, somewhere in there. And my last time I got training in that, since I retired in 2006. I did have times when I needed to restrain someone. I don't ever remember ever. The first thing they taught us was not using a chokehold or any kind of thing that would restrict the breathing and around the neck. You never go there. But there was also training, as I remember it, regarding the so-called hog tie or whatever. And while that may not cause death, it could cause paralysis, permanent paralysis and other serious bodily injuries. So I am concerned that we focus on what happened, the unfortunate and the murder of George Floyd, and that form of restraint, and forget that there are other forms that are very dangerous themselves. So,
if you want, I can have Marshall provide a list.
Yeah, if he could, it would help in Bryn and redrafting that section on the restraints.
No problem.
Thank you. Other questions from Matt, from the committee? Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
I'll be around.
I hope so. Commissioner Sherling, are you and Colonel Birmingham available right now, or? There you are.
I am here, sir.
You look like you're
I got a weird virtual background there, so you don't get blinded.
I see. I thought you were on a boat, but
that is true, actually. That's where we live in the summer. Good morning. Would you like me just to sort of launch in? I spent a variety of time with Senator White and her committee yesterday. Thanks for taking up these important topics. I probably have about 6 hours of testimony, but you don't have the 6 hours, and I don't have 6 hours either.
We've all gotten your modernization of the policing in Vermont, and that's a very helpful document. But if we could skip right to some of the issues that are in the bill.
Sure. I think
concerns or problems, or what you support, what you don't.
I think there's more that unites us than divides us on all of these topics, both from the executive branch to the legislative branch, but also communities to law enforcement. And as I described to Senator White's committee yesterday, a lot of this work has been going on for years, and we are now at an inflection point where we have an opportunity to, rather than walking toward the future, to run toward that future as quickly as possible, and to accelerate many of the things that we've been talking about, even as recently as January in our modernization strategy that we put forth. Data systems are top of mind there. Modernizing use of force policy on a statewide basis is top of mind there. Things that you've addressed in 219. To give you an update on the data system, we are likely within a couple of weeks of tentative selection and negotiations with a selected vendor for a statewide records management system that would not only allow for the back-end reporting that you're talking about on race data collection, but on really anything that law enforcement and policing is involved in statewide. Removing personally identifying information, of course, but being able to report out on what's happening in communities, how police are responding, use of force, race data collection, not only for traffic stops, but for all interactions that occur. And are really making a robust and 21st century platform available that then also is able to not only report out in a semi-real-time basis rather than waiting a year for statistics to come out to the public, but also allow data to be mined by anyone. So if a researcher in Australia or a researcher at the University of Vermont or the Vermont State College system or in a particular town wants to conduct research on what's happening with policing and crime and disorder in our communities, they would be able to do that. We would have forward-facing portals and APIs to that data. So that's where we're headed. I sent you a few minutes ago an example of what the output of one of those of this kind of system would allow us to do on a rolling basis. It's 2018 use of force data dashboard that we developed just a few months ago. So that should be in your email box. I think the document I sent speaks for itself. So if you'd like me to go through components of it, I'll do that. But to preserve time, maybe it makes sense to pivot to 219 and then to also give you some important background information. In that dashboard screenshot I sent you, I want to couch this in saying I'm going to give the committee and by extension everyone listening some background to frame the issue, not because I don't want it to come across as defensive, like we don't have a problem. We have a variety of problems in not only in modern policing, but in the way we affect lots of different things, ranging from healthcare to policing to schools, that all need modernization in terms of the way we operate to ensure that we're fair and equitable across the board. So this should not be taken as being standoffish or minimizing the problem, but I do think it's important to illustrate the scope of force that's used on an annual basis. In 2018, the Vermont State Police handled 117,711 events, which at a minimum involves 300,000 contacts with the public. That's a very conservative number. It's probably significantly higher than that. The number of those events in which force of any kind beyond simple compliant handcuffing was used was 223. Of that 223, 163 involved some kind of control and restraint. So holding arms, the things you see most often on television, someone on the hood of a cruiser with their arm being held and they're not being compliant about handcuffing, those kinds of things. Firearms were pointed in 49 of 118,000 events. Hand strikes were used or some kind of physical strike was used in 32 of 118,000 events. And the list goes on. I'll just give you a couple of other examples. Tasers were used, actually discharged 15 times. Capstun or pepper spray was used 10 times. You heard earlier an example of a misuse of a canine in another state. Canines were used 6 times, and firearms were discharged 4 times across 118,000 events. So that just frames, it doesn't diminish the importance of doing these things in a contemporary way it just gives you a sense of what we're trying to control. So the scope of what we're trying to modernize is a relatively small cross-section of what's done by law enforcement on a day-to-day basis. It is among the most impactful things that are done. So it rises to the top level of importance, not because of frequency, but because of impact and severity. That's the point I am trying to get across. A couple of just quick side notes, and I know I testified to some committees about this earlier in the year. The use of force is a seizure of a person at a constitutional level. So the current guidance for law enforcement on a national level around how force is used, both appropriately and inappropriately, like you saw with the George Floyd incident and others that have come to the public for, is the subject of, I would argue, more case law in the realm of criminal law than any other topic that there is. So there is an enormous amount of guidance. Again, I don't say that to diminish the need for improvements in our policy, in improvements in the way we operate on a national level and in Vermont, but to illustrate that this is not the Wild West. There's no more written about topic. There's no topic that has a greater amount of both restrictions and guidance for law enforcement, and by extension, the training that goes with that, than this topic. So again, just important to note for context. I'm sort of going through my head all the various things that are in both our modernization strategy from January and the document that is, it's not just the Department of Public Safety's document, but is a result of a variety of again, accelerating work to try to move the ball as far down the field as possible. And that brings me to just another observation, which is when we look nationally at the need to modernize policing, if you use the football analogy, there are some agencies, and I picked on Minneapolis yesterday, so I'll do it again today. I would argue that their need to move the ball is closer to the full 100 yards of the field than Vermont. We still have much progress that needs to be made. We are still pretty far from the touchdown in the end zone, but the distance we've got to move down the field is quite different than in many other places around the country. So just want to remind folks that there are more than 1,000 law enforcement officers in Vermont, and they respond to over an average of about 1,400 calls for service every day. And the overwhelming majority of those, great service to Vermonters and visitors, is accomplished. And that is the end goal. We're working for Vermont communities based on the standards that are set by Vermont communities, in part through this body. So with that framing in mind, maybe it makes sense just to walk through 219, and again, more areas of concurrence and agreement than we likely have areas where we differ. And I think in the areas where there may be a difference of opinion from, say, what the Human Rights Commissioner or the Defender General would put forth, and where we would be is simply how we get there, not whether we should get there. So I think we're largely aligned. On Section 2, funding and compliance with race data collection, we concur. I would actually go a little bit further and extend this to the remainder of the sections and say that perhaps one of the ways to ensure that we are getting a uniform product around policing in Vermont, and that you're getting what you need without having to wade into every single policy that's out there, is to say, all the departments in Vermont have to have uniform policy that is standardized, not a model that you work from to build your own, a standardized best practice policy. And without that, you cannot get access to grants that flow through the state. And I would go a step further to say, maybe you can't even send a recruit to the academy, or you cannot access training. By default, we're sort of shutting you off if you are not, if you're not embracing and executing best practice. So on Section 2, I think we're aligned. There may be some, additions there to the way that that gets executed. Section 3 is an extension of that use of collecting use of force data and race data. Again, I think we should be going further. As I described, the system we're going to deploy will have the ability to collect data in a more granular fashion across all of the interactions that happen in policing in Vermont. So I think in that regard, we're suggesting we go much further than you've suggested in the legislation. In section 4, that's the section about a statewide use of force policy. Again, we concur there should be a single statewide policy. Where we likely differ here is, you've heard the folks say this is the time for action. I agree. I do think you should pass something now, strike while the iron is hot, move the ball as far down the field as possible, to stay with the existing analogy. This is one where I would temper that a little bit, though. And I would, if I were in your committee, I would be, and I guess I can suggest it here, but if I was debating with the committee, on the committee, I would do the same thing. This is where I would look at a direction to adopt a statewide policy that meets best practice. And in the absence of that, you're no longer eligible for funding, training, et cetera, through the state, rather than get into the granularity of the policy. And the reason for that is we're not trying to shirk the need for oversight by elected officials in the community. We actually embrace that. But if it's memorialized in a statutory framework, it actually inhibits our ability to improve it on an ongoing basis. We are constantly making improvements to policy. We're constantly saying you can't do this or you can do that. And if it's a rigid structure in a statute, we lose that ability to constantly improve what we're doing. So I think where the two things would intersect is you tell us the framework of the things that you want to always be in that policy. You tell us that you want that policy to apply across the board to all interactions with all Vermonters, all visitors, and all departments. And then you keep an eye on what we have in that policy. And if we fail to address all the key things, then you go a step further. And that creates, I think, the requisite balance between oversight and the ability to constantly evolve and keep at a level where we're doing the best practice. Section 5, improper restraint. I think you'll hear from others as well. This already exists. If a police officer uses force beyond what is appropriate, either by the existing body of law, which is extensive, or by an existing statute, we've got the ability to prosecute them now. Yes, I recognize that is done very infrequently in Vermont, but I would submit that the reason for that is, again, we're much closer to the goalpost than many other places. So the reason is not that we haven't extended accountability far enough. It's that we're lucky, knock on wood, that the number of those events is relatively small. Section 6 is, I think 5 and 6 are sort of bolted together, so I think I addressed that. Section 7, video recording equipment, absolutely. When I was in Burlington, we were early adopters of body cameras. I can very happily report that we successfully finished a negotiation with a selected vendor for the state police body cameras yesterday, and we hope to execute that contract within the next few days. So that project is now rapidly moving forward. We do support the use of body cameras statewide, as has been flagged by the Defender General and others. The only thing that stands in the way there, besides a mandate, I think we would be fine with that, is the funding, especially in the wake of COVID. It's already difficult enough for municipalities. So we'd have to find a mechanism.
My hope was that the Congress would pass a law, their policing law would include funding for body cameras for local police. That's one of the reasons we didn't put a mandate in. On the other hand, I am concerned that where every state police officer would have a body camera, but not DMV inspectors, not fish and game. And do you think we should add that group in of law enforcement as well? I mean, they are in uniform. They are doing uniform
Yeah, I actually, I'm sorry, Senator, I'm not up to speed on their current equipment, so I can't speak to that. And I don't want to be seen as being opportunistic, but I will flag that earlier in the year, we did put forth as part of our modernization strategy, the agency model for public safety,
Right.
which would include trying to get to uniformity of a variety of different things, including cameras, and it's a much larger conversation, but we do believe that 50 years of studies, there's enough body of evidence out there that that is a good strategy.
Bryn, could you check with the commissioners of motor vehicles and commissioner of
Liquor control,
liquor control and
they have Fish and
what's the-
Wildlife
Fish and Wildlife. Thank you.
and the Secretary of State's office.
Well,
They have certified law enforcement investigators.
yeah,
If you
I'm
want
not
to include all of them, they're about 100.
I know, and I don't want to, Senator White. I was trying to look
Oh.
at who's uniform and routinely interacting with the public. And, DMV is on the side of the road frequently. If something happens, they may be the first law enforcement available, as our Fish and Wildlife folks. And we had a case with a Fish and Wildlife officer down here in Bennington who certain complaints were made. And I think it would have been better had he had a body camera rather than somebody who claimed to be a victim having a cell phone. So I would limit it to DMV at this point and Fish and Wildlife. Because they are uniform, they're more interact with the general public.
I think that's the bulk of Section 8 would, you can certainly leave it in. It's at this stage is not necessary. We have identified the funding and that camera project's moving forward, but it doesn't hurt to leave it there, I suppose.
Well, I think that was Stephanie Barrett from Joint Fiscal. We were concerned that you didn't have, we knew that you had the money to buy them. That was the money to, anyway, the money to ongoing storage. Excuse me. Yeah, storage.
I think that walks through 219. A couple of side notes for folks that are listening.
Senator Baruth had a comment or a question. Senator Baruth.
I do. Thank you, Commissioner Sherling. I have I guess a disagreement with the framing that you began with. Not that I specifically disagree with anything that you said, but it leads us down a road towards saying that best practice, voluminous case law, all of those things are doing a good job here in Vermont. Our numbers are very small. It's all sort of designed to let the air out of the balloon and say, well, we don't really have an urgent problem. But I know, your history in Burlington is such that you would know of this case, but the Bellavance case. So Officer Bellavance responded to, in 2019, a call from What Ails You. And if people on the committee haven't seen the video, it is far and away the most disturbing video that I've seen from an incident in Vermont, where you had a pretty routine fight was called in. I think it turns out that it wasn't really a fight. It was a couple of people in the bar disagreeing with one another. The officer comes up and his body camera is activated. And without introducing himself, he comes in to the person who's ultimately victimized, and he just shoves him into a concrete wall and knocks him unconscious. And that officer is still working at the Burlington Police Department. So I'm at a loss for how to make sense of best practice, case law, all of that seems to have done nothing to produce the result, which I think anybody who views that video would come to the conclusion should happen, which is that officer should have been fired immediately. And instead, we're now here in mid 2020, and he's still employed by the Burlington Police Department. There's now an active petition to get rid of him. But that's what's driving this bill, is the fact that best practice doesn't get the result that justice seems to deserve.
Understood, Senator. I have seen that video. So a couple of, I think, important observations. One, in the suite of strategies that we put forth, there are a variety of additional things beyond what's in 219 that would also address those kinds of events. So we're very much pushing for additional reforms that relate to that as well. I also want to observe that as we push for those things, including more transparency around misconduct allegations and the outcome of investigations, that we need to do so in a way that's mindful that we employ humans and they're going to make mistakes. And some of them are going to be de minimis mistakes and relatively unimpactful, and others are going to be substantial and may need to be fatal to their careers. But we need folks to recognize that, and recognize that this is the most forward-facing job probably in the world, not just in government. And that's something we readily accept, and readily accept that there needs to be oversight and accountability. To fix the problem you're describing is actually not to change or reframe the use of force standard in statute. We need to reform the labor law. You cannot simply summarily fire an employee in most circumstances, including instances in many cases where they make an error, or they are, it's often hard to prove malice. So sometimes you have to fall back on it's an error, it's not malice, because it's difficult to get in someone's head unless they're verbalizing what's happened or there's a track record. But the place to look there is in accountability and what we allow employers, in particular police departments, to do in the disciplinary process. So there is a way forward there. I know from conversations with, in particular, the Troopers Union, who is supportive of reform, eager to find that balance to make sure we're taking care of employees that are doing a difficult job, but we're also holding we're holding everyone accountable. In particular, we're holding the ones that are bad for the job accountable at the level you're describing. And I'm not ascribing that to Officer Sergeant Bellavance. I don't know all the circumstances. At face value, it is exactly what you're describing. But as a general rule, I think we do need some overhaul to allow more flexibility for us to jettison people that are incongruent with the way we should be doing business in the 21st century. I would submit that there's nothing in 219 that's going to allow that.
If I could just jump in, I'm responding to your, what I saw as you asking that we, to use your phrase, not get into the granularity of the policy, but rather leave it to best practice among the agencies and departments to produce something, as you said, that was continually updated. What I would suggest, hang on. So what I would say is that your response to my question just now was to immediately fall back on, well, the union won't let us fire someone who didn't announce his presence and then knocked a man unconscious for no apparent reason. So
that's not accurate. And I don't mean to sound argumentative.
And if I could finish, then you can respond. So what I would say is that this bill is an attempt to set a statewide policy on the use of force. And if your testimony is that we should leave that to best practice as developed among departments, this is why people don't trust departments to develop the policy.
I may have failed to adequately explain what I'm talking about. What I'm suggesting is a two-layered approach. There needs to be the ability to have an ongoing, continuously improved, iterative process to maintain a use of force policy on a statewide basis that is the current state of best practice for Vermont and nationally. That is exactly what we need to have. Whether you legislate that or we develop it under at your direction to ensure that departments can continue to maintain funding for various things. What is missing from the equation is if someone violates that policy, it's existing labor law that does not allow us to take certain action. It's not the union. It is statutory frameworks and limitations on what we're allowed to do to discipline employees. There is due process. And I'm not in any way suggesting we should get away from that due process. But if you want to draw a direct line to officer is accused of excessive force, and that's validated, you have to draw a line to what we're then allowed to do with that officer. Right now, we are restricted, not in part occasionally by contracts, but statute's going to govern that. So I'm saying that my bringing up the unions was to say they're largely in alignment with us. Again, there's more that unites us than divides us, whether you're in the advocacy community, you're in the legislature, you're in the executive branch, you're in a law enforcement agency, or you're in a union right now. We all see this as an opportunity to accelerate forward the things we've been talking about for years. We don't want to miss this opportunity. What I'm trying to do is help you frame the best way forward to allow for constant improvement on one hand and accountability on the other.
Okay.
We're going to the same place. We're just taking a different path.
Commissioner, I know you've got to move to something else in 5 minutes. So, and I've got to move to a break in 2 seconds. So Senator White, if you have the final word.
I just wanted to say that in
hopefully it's
terms of
brief.
disciplining and dealing with sanctions for police officers, we've been working on that with the Training Council for a long time, and we continue to work on it. And as new prohibitions are put into the law, like if we prohibit knee holds or choke holds or whatever it is, then that will be part of the sanctions and how you deal with them. And if you haven't read it and don't understand the way the Training Council works in terms of sanctions, we can get an explanation of that. But we're working on that in GovOps about how we do these sanctions and how we hold people accountable. So it isn't in here, but it is someplace.
Okay, but
if I may, Mr. Chairman,
yeah,
just to super synopsize this, we agree that we should be improving our ability to hold people accountable, especially as it relates to use of force. What I'm suggesting is some tweaks to the approach that we think will be more impactful on a long-term basis and allow for constant improvement. And if we fail at that, you can always come back and do the line by line. But I actually don't think that is going to get where you need to go.
Well, it may be, but I think it's, I appreciate your testimony, Commissioner. We may have to have you back on this particular point because I think there's a lot of disagreement within the committee. But I will say this, that my biggest concern is, just as it was with the education community, teachers particularly, you end up with situations where somebody has done something improper in one community and then moves on to the next and gets hired without some kind of knowledge by the other community. And we saw that recently here in Vermont, and that is a big concern of mine.
That is also in our strategy, sir, in the 10-point plan.
And it's also in the current disciplinary.
Senator Baruth, I said White had the last word. You got the last. You definitely have the last word.
Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering if Bryn could, between now and when we next meet, if she could, as the commissioner pointed out, check out, are there any interactions with labor law that would thwart some of the intentions of this bill? If there are, is it possible to not withstand those? For instance, if somebody uses deadly force in a manner that's contrary to the statute, is there anything in labor law that would protect such a person? that would be good to know for next time.
Well, I mean, one of the things that impressed me is the immediate firing of the 4 officers in Minneapolis. And so I would want to make sure that can be done here. That I thought was by the city of Minneapolis was, and I don't know why they were able to do it. Would we be able to do that here?
I do think we would be in a scenario where we could do that here, and that's a really clear-cut case. I think where we're looking for the latitude, and you're looking for the latitude, is in other cases, a more nuanced approach.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank
We're
you.
going to take a 1-minute break till 10:30, maybe 2. Peggy, thank you. And then we'll hear from Curtis Reed. Okay.
Okay, I'm here.
Whenever I realize said 1 minute, 1
Yeah.
minute is a very short time.
We're still on live YouTube.
That's fine.
Yep.
People realize we're coming right back. And as soon as I see committee back here, we'll start with Curtis Reed.
Yep.
Who, by the way, has been extremely helpful in the Bennington community. So, while we're waiting to get the committee started.
Yeah. There are challenges everywhere.
There are. There certainly are. It appears, Bryn, that decertification is an important part of this issue here. So I don't know whether that's Senator White's committee or this committee or how we can make sure, but it seems to be a critical point that we just touched on in the last conversation.
Yeah.
Soon as Senator Bruce and Nick are back and White, we'll get started. Bryn, any thoughts to this point? Or you're not here either.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
All right, just took me.
There's a couple of suggested changes that for when we do get to markup of the bill that have been made today that I think there's pretty much agreement on. So I assume you've been keeping track of those.
I have. I have the changes that have been recommended by the Human Rights Commission
Yeah.
and the Defender General. It seems to me like Commissioner Sherling made some pretty sweeping recommendations. I'm not sure if the committee wants to take that direction or not.
Well,
So I'll
I
wait
think
to.
the use of deadly force remains that place out there where there is still some discussion about how to move with that. I think that's going to be one of the more hotly debated issues. I do think the idea of some kind of a sanction if you fail to turn your body camera on with part of Section 8 would be helpful. That refers back to the policy. All right, why don't we get started? We've got the committee back. Senator Bruce should be here fairly shortly. So Curtis Reed is our next witness. Curtis, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
It's always interesting to see our backgrounds.
Well, this particular background is a Berber rug from about 100 years ago.
Wow.
One of my lesser known titles is I'm a collector of African art.
Oh.
And so this is one of the key pieces in my collection from about 100 years ago. So for the record, my name is Curtis Reed Jr. I am Executive Director of Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. We are in year 17 and a half of a 40-year initiative called Vermont Vision for a Multicultural Future. Our vision is that Vermont be the model for inclusive and equitable practice across the United States. I'm also the chair of the Vermont Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. We issued in 2009 the briefing on racial profiling and law enforcement that spawned a lot of the evolution and transformation of state law enforcement. And I'm a founding member of the Fair and Impartial Policing Commission. But my most important role is that of father. I'm the father of 3 Black children, 2 young men and a daughter. And I want to give you a sense of change or the lack of change in the state. I came here during the nor'easter of 1978 to go skiing. Had a great experience here and decided to move to Vermont 6 months later in 1979. My first 6 months in Vermont, I met 90% of the police department in Brattleboro. Not for any reason for having called 911. 911 didn't exist back then, but because it was the stated policy of the Brattleboro Police Department to stop and interrogate every Black and brown visitor or resident of the town on the suspicion that we were dealing drugs. Fast forward 2 decades later, and our work with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, I was a very strong advocate at the time that you can't legislate leadership. And I know Senator White might remember this conversation of, do we make data collection, do we make policies, do we make those mandatory? And I argued that they should not be mandatory, that at the time, I strongly felt that the leadership of Vermont State Police would be the beacon around which other law enforcement agencies, sheriff's departments, local PDs would then rally behind in terms of more modern practices, 21st century practices in policing. And so, offered and strongly advocated for not legislating those kinds of actions. But where I find myself today is, I think the committee, I think Senator White was correct that we should have legislated those things, those matters. And therein lies the challenge, because we have 50 plus departments, each one operating out of a different culture. And I think that we're a small enough state where we have the advantage to be able to say to all departments, these are your policies, these are our collective policies, these are our practices, this is what our training looks like, this is what hiring and supervision will look like. And I don't think that's unreasonable at this point, given that we've had over a decade of hoping that people would do the right thing, hoping departments would do the right thing. And I say that out of an abundance of concern for young African-American and Latino residents and visitors to the state, because they don't know, as they move from one jurisdiction to another, whether or not the policies are consistent and whether or not the practices, more importantly, are consistent. And so the conversations that we're having now, I think, need to overcome the hurdle of local control. And I think that's where you're going to find the greatest pushback in trying to codify on a statewide level the work that's being done now. In terms of 219, yeah, I support the work that's being done thus far. I agree with the commissioner that we have a lot more in common than we have apart. That there's, and for full disclosure, I helped develop that modernization plan, the 10 points that has been presented. But there's one issue that's not on there that I think needs to be addressed. And that is the Criminal Justice Training Council that currently, as written, they don't report to anyone except themselves. I think they need to fall underneath the executive branch in terms of having someone or some agency to say to them, you need to really prioritize X, Y, and Z. And that for me is a loose link in the criminal justice system, because we want them to do the training, to design the training, deliver training, but they don't, they're not beholden to any state agency, and whether that's the agency of administration, whether it's putting them underneath the responsibility and jurisdiction of the Department of Public Safety, or somewhere else. But I strongly believe that we need to move them into state government. I also think that when we talk about, and I really agree with Matt, that our data collection systems need to be reformed, and they need to be much more expansive and much more consumer friendly. The Criminal Research Group data, it's really dense, but it's not consumer friendly. I think we need to make sure that data across all points, whether it be use of force, whether it be traffic stops, it needs to also include pedestrian stops. We have, officers on the street in some of our more urban areas that, they're encountering citizens, that we need to be able to keep track of those encounters, not just motor stops, but also all interactions between law enforcement and residents and visitors. But on balance, we're fully supportive of 219 in its current gestation. And I would ask the committee to take up at maybe another point in time, where we host and how we view the training council as part of government. So, thank you.
Secretary.
Thank you. Can I comment first and then I'll
Sure.
go to you? I think you raised regarding the Criminal Justice Training Council, an important distinction. I have to tell you, before I was in state Senate, I always thought the Criminal Justice Training Council was part of the Vermont State Police. It just made sense that they would be. And I came from Massachusetts where they were. And right now we have an opportunity because there's an interim director, I think, or they're still in the process of hiring a replacement for Rick Gothian. I think it's a tremendous opportunity to reimagine that agency. So the place where it would get reimagined is probably government operations. So I'll now yield to Senator White.
I was going to say, Curtis, I think you've been invited to, and we've divided our testimony into different topics. The first one we're doing today is improper conduct and how we sanction and all of that around improper conduct. Starting on Tuesday, we're doing the training council, how we train, what our training, how we hire, how we promote, all of that has to do with the kind of the body of the police departments. And so we're taking that all up in GovOps. And I'm sure you've received an invite, not just reached the number for Bill. Just an invite to be part of the conversation.
I haven't received an invite yet, but I'll check my mail.
I'll make sure you do because we sent out about 100 of them.
Okay.
I'll make sure you get it. Yeah.
Other questions for Curtis Reed? And Curtis, thank you for the testimony. Very helpful. And also, you kind of put a little history there with the Brattleboro Police Department I was not aware of. Is there still that today in Brattleboro area, or is that
no, not in Brattleboro. And part of the reason I'm involved in this work is that I'm raising 3 kids in Vermont, or I've raised 3 kids in Vermont. 2 of them have long gone, but wanting to make sure that they did not encounter the same kind of profiling that I did. Now, 10 years ago, that profiling was still continuing. I mean, my oldest son, was stopped. I can't tell you how many times. My younger son didn't have a car, so he wasn't stopped as much. But the difference for some areas of the state is that the sort of the unspoken. I mean, you can no longer say as a part of your stated policy is to profile Black and brown folks. You just can't do that. But the unspoken culture within the department, and there's certain areas of the state that I know to avoid, because that is what is in operation right now. So that's why I mentioned that the real challenge is, how are you going to herd, the 50 plus jurisdictions under a common practice, training and practice. Local departments oftentimes will shirk their training responsibilities because they can, because there's no one, there's no stick. One of the things I like about 219 is that you have a stick there, and that's state grants. If you're not, in this case, collecting data, but I also believe they should expand it to include training, use of force policies, et cetera, that will in fact create the incentive for people to do, or departments to do what they ought to have been doing for decades now.
Senator Benning has a question.
Curtis, you've reminded me of something, and I'm kind of curious. 5 years before your run-in with the Brattleboro police, I had my own run-in with the police in what I'm going to classify as a different form of implicit bias, because I had long hair down to my shoulders that was parted in the middle, and it was automatically assumed by the police officers in my town that I must be involved in drug activity for that reason alone. And I was falsely arrested and went through a rather horrendous period in my life, which I'm sure pales in comparison to yours. But the bottom line was, through the years, somehow that mentality disappeared. And you've just raised the issue of Brattleboro not having now that mentality that they had when you first came to town. Do you have any explanation or understanding as to why that disappeared?
Very clearly, yes. It's called leadership. Gunny, who is our chief of police, has done an incredible job at turning the culture curve within the Brattleboro Police Department in much the same way that Jim Baker did of Tom, and then Colonel Birmingham. It takes solid leadership, and it was my hope that the strong leadership coming from Vermont State Police would rub off on other departments, but that didn't happen. I mean, it happened in the case of Brattleboro, but there are other places around the state where that's simply not happening. And so I have crossed over to the other side of, okay, let's legislate this, because obviously it's not going to happen in this, or in my idealized organic fashion over a decade ago. And so, yeah.
Well, it's good to know there's some light at the end of the tunnel. In closing, I just want to criticize you for claiming that Jeanette was right way back when, because we're going to be dealing now with Jeanette. Her head will explode. We're just going to have to take that on. But thank you very much for your comments.
Yeah,
Sure.
Thank you, Curtis. I really appreciate it. And by the way, Senator Baruth, I'm just checking my email to find out that my next meeting's been canceled, which is great news. But Senator Baruth did send us a link to the Bellavance footage that he was referring to.
Okay.
So Peggy, if you could post that link in our committee website, a committee, whatever you call it, page, whatever. Also,
Well, I thank you for the opportunity.
thank you, Curtis. I really appreciate your testimony.
Okay,
Hopefully, if we have questions, you'll be available down the road.
definitely. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Our next witness, I'm going to jump to Eaton. And I'm sorry, Dr. Nasruddin. I always have a hard time with your name.
You could just say, hey, you. I mean, that would work.
Hey, you.
Oh, I'm trying. Oh, there. Okay.
There you
Got
are.
it.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yes. And we appreciate you and I being here, and I have a hard time with names frequently, even my own. So
I guess I should introduce myself. I am Dr. Eitan Nasreddin Longo. I am the chair of the advisory panel on racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. I'm also the co-chair of the Fair and Impartial Policing Committee, of which Curtis Reed was a founding member. I'm here to talk primarily about S219, but there are a couple other things that I would just briefly pull in here. Please bear with me. I'm computer illiterate and I'm trying to pull things up that all at the same time. I earlier this morning forwarded a copy of the RDAP, which is what we call the advisory panel, because you get out of breath by the time you get through it. We just call it the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel, or RDAP. We wrote a report, as I'm sure you are aware, and submitted it on the 4th of December of last year, pursuant to our mandate under Act 54 of 2017. One of the parts of that mandate in Act 54 asks the panel to consider whether to expand law enforcement race data collection practices to include data on non-traffic stops by law enforcement. This kind of piggybacks very nicely with what Curtis just spoke to. And I'm reading now from the report. The panel spent a great deal of time on the issue of data collection. The panel believes that data collection is a vital issue, one that needs to be addressed early as we grapple with the challenges and the injustice represented by racial disparities. There's a bunch. As I say, I have sent a copy of this to Peggy Delaney, so I won't go all the way through it. If you have access to it right now,
we do. It's on our committee page.
Grand. I'm on pages 5 and 6. This again gets to points that Curtis just made. We ask, or recommend, I guess, about expanding and improving data collection with respect to law enforcement. Traffic stop data collection should be improved by providing resources for ensuring that data is fully collected, that data is made fully available to the public more rapidly than it is at present, that it is both collected and categorized consistently across the state. This is a point that's been made several times in what I've been listening to, that you really got to pull it together here, make it standard so that people aren't comparing apples and oranges. Further, the panel strongly urges a commitment to staffing and other resources to collect and compile data properly. This could include creating centralized statewide staffing with responsibility for assisting with data collection and compilation from police agencies and other entities across the state. I think given what's just come from Commissioner Sherling before the break, and certainly now from Curtis, this actually bolsters those points. Again, as Curtis was talking about how the data from CRG is very dense, difficult to hold, a focus on consistency, clarity, and accessibility of data across all data collection efforts, I would say is essential. And then, of course, mechanisms to ensure accountability and compliance. We, as the panel, are behind 219. We do also feel that the process of collection should be improved and expanded. This is on page 6. This is the discussion of the recommendations. And it should be improved by providing resources for ensuring that the data are fully collected, that they are made fully available to the public, collected and categorized consistently. Also, data collection should be expanded to include information about use of force incidents. Again, piggybacking on comments that Curtis made. The next part is, I think, rather important. We talked a great deal in the report and in subsequent meetings about needing to create centralized staffing with responsibility for collection and compilation. Part of this would be, and this will get to what I'll say at the end, it would reduce the burden on individual agencies. We recommend, again, focus on consistency, clarity, and accessibility. That will be necessary, all of those points, for agencies and entities to work together and to understand how their areas of responsibility interact and potentially contribute to racially disparate outcomes. The next paragraph is, to my mind, extraordinarily important. A mandate to collect more data without the resources to aggregate and analyze the information will do little to address the data gap issue. When data are collected without a plan for their integration, aggregation, and analysis with other data sets, their usefulness is diminished. Any new data collection must be considered from a systems perspective and be informed by the principles of data governance, the best practices in handling data. This came up the other night. We had our monthly meeting on Tuesday. We meet on the second Tuesday of every month from 6 to 8 p.m. When we're not on Meet Space, we're doing this. We were concerned as a group with disparate possibilities for data collection in different departments. In some ways, this bill reads as a kind of large agency-centric bill, yeah? In other words, the collection of these data will be much easier for larger departments in the state. It is somewhat as though people have forgotten that this is a predominantly rural state. 219 sounds wonderful, we like it, but it manifestly does not address the problems that will be faced by small departments around this rural state, with perhaps only 3 or 4 people who will have to compile these data. An outcome of this can easily be that some departments, such as VSP, will be quote unquote well-behaved and thus well-funded, and others will be some kind of poor relation that's literally from the country. It's a bit ironic, I think, almost a bit funny. S219 stands to create another kind of disparate treatment towards law enforcement in the service of ameliorating disparate racial treatment in the citizenry writ large. And the panel hopes that this can be rectified. This is partly why the RDAP in its report spoke to the need to have these efforts funded. VSP itself has one person who does the data collection as a sideline. It is not her main job. I repeat, it is not her main job. And VSP gets looked at all the time as someone who does this really well. I would say right now that is by the grace of God and Betty, and by the skin of our teeth. That's the fact that there's one person doing this as a sort of sideline speaks to the problems here with legislative requests of this sort. You absolutely have to fund these sorts of initiatives for what I now hope are obvious reasons. There's enough acrimony among law enforcement agencies in the state without exacerbating this by creating a law that will enshrine their real and imagined differences. At this point in time, in this tense social moment, as much unity as can be had might be something to try to affect. I would also just point out briefly that RDAP is, I mean, you've got this body. We have 5 community members, including myself, on it, who've been working on the issues that Commissioner Sherling et al. Have brought up to you today. I would ask on their behalf, I have been contacted this morning pleased to come back to you. People have been working on this, on the changes that have been underway, not merely since the murder of George Floyd, but before. You have a report before you that addresses many of these issues and did so back in December. We would very much like to come back to you and give further presentation. And that's all I have to say.
This muting, unmuting.
I know.
In terms of coming back to us, this is the frustration
Indeed.
that I have, is that I have little time to come back, but I would
I
love to have you
understand.
back if there are specific things we can do in the short term. One of the frustrations of our funding crisis is that without help from the federal government, we're looking at a $400 million deficit in state
I
funds.
understand.
So that is another realistic challenge in terms of the data collection. But I totally agree with you. I mean, when we went through Justice Reinvestment 2, one of the frustrations was trying to get these systems to even be modernized. And then we saw the complete breakdown in the Department of Labor because of outmoded computer systems and outmoded data systems. So if that's not an example of the need to update our abilities, I don't think anything else is. And obviously there's a lot of people still suffering out there. And I got a message from someone just a minute ago, and that's why I had my ear to the phone, was about unemployment and family that is suffering without enough money to get through the weekend. So I usually don't do that, but I want to apologize to you for having the phone to my ear, but that was the reason. Somebody who I had tried to help with unemployment, who needed the money by today and hasn't gotten it yet. So
yes, I certainly understand that things are moving quite quickly. It's hard to coordinate this in terms of RDAP coming back. I would hope still that that can be affected. In the meantime, I would suggest taking another look at the report, perhaps very specifically at the further recommendation section, which comes after the section I just spoke of, and also the non-consensus reports. Again, that's really kind of an awkward thing for me to suggest, because I'm here as representing the entire panel. And the reason we had non-consensus reports everybody didn't agree. So in a certain sense, I'm going out on thin ice here by saying you should really look at those, because there are going to be some people on the panel who don't like my saying that. I am giving myself that liberty because we are at a very, very tender moment. And I think some of the things in there may not be as non-consensual now as they were in December. So I put that forth just to suggest. And also I'm going to go on the record and say, I realize I may be overstepping my bounds.
You're not.
But I think a lot of what is going on now was in this report. We are in a position to amplify things that have been stated and hope for the opportunity to do so.
Yeah. Regarding data collection, hopefully we can make some progress on that. Obviously, there's been a number of recommendations to expand the data beyond just traffic stops, but all interactions, all use of force. But you make a good point that, like many things here, it's written for the larger communities, maybe not the rural communities with one constable. Other questions for Dr.
NL.
NL. thank you so much for your time with us.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to come back next week, some things come up, let Peggy know, please.
I will let Peggy know. I'd love to come back next week. Thank you, sir.
That would be fine. Can
Great.
we turn the
Eitan, I hope we hear from you this afternoon.
Oh, I didn't.
You
I
should
didn't
have
know
gotten
about
an
this.
invite. Yeah, you should have gotten an invite.
I will.
Check
I will investigate this.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Senator, excuse me. Assistant Attorney General Julio Thompson is our next witness. And Pepper, we may not get to you today. I hope you'll be available next week.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Thank you. I forgot we have to stop at 11:30 because we have to be on the Senate floor, or whatever you call that virtual meeting. Julio, if you need more time, we can certainly provide that as well.
Okay. Well,
Welcome to Senate. Good to see you again.
it's been a long time. It's good to see people's faces.
It has, yes.
Here they're talking. Good morning. So I'm Julio Thompson. I'm an Assistant Attorney General and Director of the Attorney General's Civil Rights Unit. My experience in police or use of force issues really comes both before and kind of a part of my usual duties in the Civil Rights Unit. Our unit does not have civil enforcement authority regarding biased policing. Boer-Yanks, who I think is still online with us, the Human Rights Commission has jurisdiction to field complaints of discriminatory policing under the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations statute. I am familiar with the area of use of force and biased policing going back. I think for me personally, it started in 1991. I was in Los Angeles and became involved in an investigation of the LA Sheriff's Department. And that resulted in a report released in July 1992 that had 250 recommendations for reform, which were then overseen by a county appointed monitor, which ran for many years. And I've worked on use of force issues relating to a lot of different police departments, providing technical assistance and collecting information over the years. There are a lot of people in the country, both current and former police executives, criminologists, and many members of the community, thousands really over the years who worked on these issues. There's a lot of resources out there. And in the past week, I've tried to guide people to some of them. For example, last March, the conference on civil rights, which is a coalition of more than 200 civil rights agencies, published two materials relating to police reform by local communities. One is a toolkit specifically for how local communities can work with their town managers and police departments to affect change. And another is a very dense, I think it's 416 guidebook that is chock full of examples of best practices on areas ranging from search and seizure to bias policing, use of force, de-escalation, community policing, officer accountability. So there are a lot of resources out there. That's kind of the background from which I run, and I won't consume more time talking about that. The one lesson that I learned from working on these issues is that it's essential that you have community input at several phases in the development process, and that is input before you set this, or you try to draft the standard. And I think we're trying to do some of that now. But then after the people who are working on those policies then post a policy. And then there's similar to rulemaking, there's a public comment period where members of the public, anybody really, can access the policies online, submit written comments, which the folks working on the policy will take into account. And usually there are public hearings to have people talk about what issues of a given policy are priorities. For example, today, the Baltimore Police Department has roughly 60 draft policies that are available and are in a comment period for members of the public. So I think when we address all of these issues, it's good to have the technicians, people who do the research about different practices involved. But it's really essential that you hear from as many people as possible, because in my experience with those developments, they inevitably come up with ideas or nuances in dealing with use of force or communications or equipment or tactics and training that really affects how officers will carry themselves on the street. For example, I'll just give you one example. A long time ago when I was working in LA County, there was a lot of public input and a lot of questions about why the department had not developed a feedback loop between its use of force reviews and its training bureau. The question was, if an officer is in a significant encounter or a high risk encounter, are they getting the input from the training officials about what the department actually trains on those kind of scenarios, like things like high risk traffic stops or building entries, search warrants, and so forth. And the community also asked, well, why aren't you using the lessons learned from those cases in your own training? Why aren't you developing training scenarios to learn the lesson from that case about what to do and what not to do? So if a case is resolved very successfully, or it's very tactically sound decisions, teach that and reinforce it. If it's handled poorly or things could have been done better, train that as well so that officers won't repeat the same mistakes. That was community input, and that feedback loop has now become among the many best practices that are out there in policing. So I encourage as much community input as you can get, because there will be people who will see the forest while we're looking at the trees in the tree park. Turning to S219, yeah, we support the bill. I think there are many sections here. I wanted to address briefly our views on the section relating to the standard for force. And I agree, Mr. Chair, that there's going to be a lot of debate about what the standard is. But I wanted to clear up maybe some misconceptions or provide a little bit more background about that use of force standard. So there was reference to the California law, which was passed in 2019, that included a necessity standard for deadly force. But I wanted to point out that, and there have been some reactions to it as if that's untested. We don't know whether it will actually work. That's a little bit of a misconception. In 2013, so roughly 7 years ago, the Seattle Police Department adopted a use of force policy in connection with a federal consent decree that required for all uses of force that they be reasonable, necessary, and proportionate to the law enforcement objective. That standard has been in place for all uses of force, and it's been in place for 7 years. Under the Seattle consent decree, the city at any time, if they find a policy is not working for their officers, they can go back to the Department of Justice and the court-appointed monitor and ask for a modification of the policy. And if there's disagreement, they can take it to the federal judge, who will then try to resolve the issue or issue a ruling about what the appropriate standard is, whether it meets the consent decree. In the 7 years that Seattle has had that policy, they've gone back and I think modified the policy 5 or 6 times, but they've never sought to modify the reasonable, necessary, and proportionate standard. That standard is in place in a growing number of agencies. It's the standard in San Francisco. It's the standard in Cleveland, New Orleans, Baltimore, Camden County, Newark, and I could probably draw up a larger list. We want practices that are based and standards that whenever we can, that they be evidence-based, that they have, if there are standards where we know that these standards have been road tested, then those are standards we ought to look at more seriously.
So you're suggesting that we should move to that standard?
I think there, and there are many variations of, I just, 3 words: reasonable, necessary, and proportional. The best
makes sense.
Use of force policies are quite detailed. They are usually more than 15 pages long, because there are all sorts of circumstances where an officer might use force, different types of force, and different types of circumstances. But I think I agree with folks, what I've heard here, that we ought to be going towards the best practice. My point here is that the necessary standard is not unknown territory. Another department I could add is Washington, D.C. The Metropolitan Police Force also has a reasonable, necessary, and proportionate standard. And And so in developing and working out the details, we have the ability to go to those departments in those communities and ask them how those standards are working. A lot of them have their own civilian review that do annual reports about how the policies are working and how force reduction or mitigation strategies are working. So our view in our office is that the AG's office, that we ought to have that broad standard for all use of force. This one focuses only on deadly force, but we think that we ought to be addressing all uses of force. When you think about the issue of necessity and proportionality, I mean, one way to look at it is to ask yourself, would we as a community or as a government accept force that we found to be unnecessary and disproportionate to the law enforcement objective? I don't think we would. So I think implicitly, we all agree that as a matter of common sense, that would be the standard. And a lot of those policies work out the details of what you would consider in deciding what's a proportionate response. For example, the nature of the offense. Is it an arrest for bank robbery or armed robbery, or is it the effort to try to cite someone for jaywalking? They go into great detail about that. And I think that a collective effort to get the best practice, I think is a shared goal by everyone. I just wanted to emphasize again on this point that a lot of this ground has been paved, and that work wasn't just done by police departments. It was done by dozens of community groups, thousands of community members in different parts of the country. They've had their voice, and I think we have examples we can work off of, but we need to hear our community's voice, because we are a different state than many of those other states.
Appreciate that.
So some of the issues that are presented here, I just wanted to point out. Senator Sears, you talked about, or there was a discussion about sanctions for turning off a body-worn camera. Again, there are many examples, fine examples of well-developed police body-worn camera policies that have been developed in conjunction with groups like NAACP, ACLU, and a broad range of LGBTQ plus communities. In some cases, the person who's in contact with the officer doesn't want to be recorded. They don't want to be, they don't want whatever their problem is to be on video. So there may be room where a person doesn't consent to recording, for example, when disclosing personal medical information, when the issue of their sexual orientation or gender identity may present problems for them. And so, again, there's lots of nuanced thinking about that. When we're just talking about an officer's unilateral decision to turn off the recording because they don't want, or the evidence suggests they don't want their actions to be recorded, I think everyone agrees that that should be a very serious sanction. It is an effort in a way to prevent the collection of evidence, which is a very, very serious violation. I'm sorry, go ahead.
We have a problem, which is time.
Okay.
Which we always have a time problem here. Could we wrap on the use of force and then ask you to come back next Wednesday and continue, Julio? And also then hear from James Pepper and some others.
Yeah, I guess for the final point, I would just want to address now, because it came up and I wasn't come up today, and it relates to something that you've asked Ms. Hare to take a look at, which are the labor relation issues. And that was raised by Chief Sherling. So part of my experience, back, I've been since 1992 or so, I've been practicing in labor and employment law. So just a couple of points on this. One, if the officer is under a collective bargaining agreement, they have a due process right to a presentation of the evidence against them and an opportunity to respond prior to their discharge. That's a result of a 1985 US Supreme Court decision called Loudermill versus Cleveland Board of Education. That's a federal constitutional right. So, and it's often in labor law called a Loudermill hearing, where an officer receives a notice of charges, what the allegations are, and then has an opportunity to present their side of the story. And then if the employer discharges them, they still have a due process right to contest that in either a civil service or a grievance process. Vermont Labor Board handles lots of those cases. The issue about while an officer is awaiting that Loudermill hearing, whether they're paid or not, is also a question of constitutional law, unless the collective bargaining agreement waives it. Under Loudermill and the cases following it, the officer's property interest in their job through a union contract protects not only their employment, but their wages. You have to have a pre-deprivation hearing, which is a Loudermill hearing, unless the collective bargaining agreement says that we as a group of employees agree there may be circumstances where we waive or that where a person can be suspended without pay. But if there is no provision, the federal constitutional cases on this say you have a due process right to keep your wages until you've had an opportunity before you're deprived of those wages to answer the charges and make your case for not losing those wages. So talking about a statutory change to deprive someone of their ability to have a pre-termination or pre-loss of wage hearing is not likely to stand muster because it's a federal constitutional issue. The final point I would make about collective bargaining agreements is that there's always two parties, at least two parties that have to sign that. The state of Vermont has to sign a collective bargaining agreement. So the terms are terms that they found acceptable and or a city or town has to do that. So there is already room for cities and towns in the state of Vermont to negotiate those terms. But I think that, and I think it's worthwhile talking and hearing other perspectives on this issue, but I just wanted to point out that it's not necessarily a matter of what Vermont statute says, but what the collective bargaining agreements say and what the US Constitution provides.
Thank
For
you
now, I'll
very
just
much.
stop and handle questions. If there are.
I think we're going to have to break right here, unfortunately, and hold our questions for next Wednesday morning. And
Okay.
Peggy, thank you so much. Brent and all of you, thanks so much. We'll pick up with Julio and then James Pepper on Wednesday and then other witnesses that Peggy's been scheduling.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Thank
Okay.
you. We do have to leave the meeting to go to the floor.